Hello, and welcome to Interpreting India. Geopolitical realignments, sustainable growth, healthcare financing, inclusive digital transformations, climate change, supply chain disruptions, urbanization, and several other critical global matters envelop the world as India's G20 presidency comes to a close. We at Carnegie India continue to bring voices from India and around the world to examine the role of technology, the economy, and international security in shaping India's future. I'm your host, Sayoudh Roy, and this time we are talking about the present and future of the energy sector in India. India has seen superlative progress in electrical connectivity, achieving 96.7% connectivity to the grid in 2020, up from around 67% about a decade ago. Despite recent progress, electrical connectivity is still racked by problems such as irregular supply and voltage fluctuations, and distribution companies face losses. 72.5% of electricity generated is derived from coal, which serves to impede our climate goals, and renewable alternatives require energy storage mechanisms that are technologically complex and depend on locally unavailable raw materials. For the discussion going forward, it helps to know that the electricity sector can be broadly split between generation, transmission, and distribution. To talk about these issues, we are joined today by Mr. Karthik Ganesan of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Mr. Ganesan is a fellow and director, research coordination at the Council, where he ensures cross-team coherence for CEW's research direction and imperatives. He also acts as an internal advisor across research teams and creates institutional platforms that spur innovation. In addition, he holds a master's degree in public policy from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore and an undergraduate degree in civil engineering and an MTech in infrastructure engineering from IIT Madras. Mr. Ganesan, welcome to Interpreting India.
Thanks, Shivu, for having me on this. Really excited for the conversation we're going to have.
So I was wondering if we could discuss some of CEW's reports that you have co-authored, and I'd like to start with a particular paper that discusses the state of electricity connections in India. And if we could perhaps start with some of the reasons why some households still do not have an electricity connection.
So, Shayud, this conversation on electricity connections is kind of passé in the sense that with the rollout of the DDUJY, which is the Deen Dayal Upadhyaya Gram Jyoti Yojana, and the subsequent Saubhagya Yojana, which basically shifted focus from village electrification to household electrification. There is an implicit understanding that we have near universal connections today, right? So when you do ask me the question about why some households don't have it, we are talking about a very small fraction, possibly less than 2%, if I may hazard a guess, because it's really it's uncertain at this point in time. But unfortunately, 2%, even in the context of a country like India, is a sizable number of households, right? And the primary reason for many of them to not have a connection today is really that the cost of extending the grid to some of these areas is exorbitant. It's a public responsibility because, obviously in such areas, the private sector does not see a benefit of rolling out services, which is why I think we also need to embrace the alternatives of how else can we electrify some of these, hard spaces to reach, whether it's a remote village in the northeast, whether it's in the hilly areas, whether it's in areas which are, frequently inundated, by floods or waters, right? Possibly somewhere in the Sundarbans, let's imagine, right? There are tens of thousands of households, which are, of course, on those islands and where they're constantly subjected to water. So given all of this, I would say, it's in that margin, and we're constantly sort of, innovating to try and figure out, how can we do distributed, renewable energy based provision, right? So you can either have a microgrid or a mini grid in some of these areas, which is self-sustaining. But again, while the government is happy to invest the capital, the maintenance of some of these systems does require a bit of training to the local individuals to be able to sort of ensure that the appropriate care is given. It's not like, these are free of any maintenance. Most centralized systems require maintenance, but the utility that you and I are connected to does that on our behalf. Whereas if you had your own solar PV system, you'd obviously have to, then try and, whether it's the cleaning of the panels, whether it's ensuring that, you are properly maintaining the battery system that's actually used to provide electricity outside of the hours when sun is shining. All of this needs to be taken care of, which means that there is a bit of a skilling requirement. And all of this is fantastic in the sense that we are building more resilience into the system because it doesn't rely on this one large grid. And if it were to go down, right, there is going to be, local disruptions. If you are able to sort of generate electricity where you are, that's utopian. So in some sense, it's a great system, but I think a lot of people who see that the grid works really well for them, especially when they look at a city, when you look at bigger towns and bigger panchayats, they're like, I also want that, right? Why should I settle for a smaller system which may not give me the capacity to run an air conditioner? In the future, they may not have the means today, but everybody has aspirations. So I would say the ones who are not connected today is because the government has not been able to reach there, and I think alternative solutions are proving to be slightly expensive. So people are making do, right? There may be a DG set or there may be something else in the vicinity, but the hope is that we will have universal electrification, even if it's not through the grid, imminently, right? If it's not already been achieved, as I said. Yeah. I hope that was kind of helpful. But historically, if you look at it, right, I would say it was the fact that the utility was just averse to extending connections, because extending a connection to a new household basically meant more scope for losses. And I think we'll discuss more about utility losses, etc., later on. But that was really the big barrier.
So connectivity is not a problem, clearly. Most households are connected. So let's talk about the state of the supply and the quality of service that these households are receiving. The households several households have seen blackouts, low voltage, and other issues. Could we talk a little bit about some of the common problems that they seem to be facing?
Yeah, I mean, as you already said, right? I mean, sitting even in both of us are in Delhi right now. And Delhi is famed for its highly reliable power supply, as is possibly metropolitan area like Mumbai. But you leave these two enclaves, right, which have a private utility that supplies to them, and you move to even another big metro like a Chennai or a Bangalore or a Kolkata, you will find that outages are the norm. Not least because they're maintained by public utilities, but really because there are multiple obligations that a utility has, and unfortunately, because of these multiple obligations, which is to serve a very diverse consumer base, right? In Mumbai and in Delhi, the consumer base is largely residential, commercial, and to some extent, light industry and light manufacturing. There isn't an agricultural consumer to speak of, right? These are fully metered. There's a clear value proposition to the consumers here for the electricity they consume. They can be charged, to recover the cost of electricity that they're being provided, right? And all of that happens very, efficiently. And the private sector obviously, has the incentive to go ahead and get the money out of the consumers. Whereas when you move to other areas, what's really happening is that you have to contend with this mix of consumers that you have, and as a result, the utility is really chasing different actors, to pay up. Having to contend with the political promises to provide free electricity to one constituency, whether it's the farmers at some point in the day, or whether it's subsidized electricity to some specific industries, or for that matter, subsidize electricity to a lot of residential households, and from whom recovery is also tough. So all of this basically means that the utility, in many cases, even in large towns, right, where you would see that the value for continuous electricity is there, because as it is evidenced by people's the presence of alternatives. For instance, somebody has a DG set right on their rooftop where the cost of electricity could be anywhere north of 15 rupees a kilowatt hour, right? Clearly means that they'd be willing to pay the utility. It's just that the utility just doesn't understand that there is a value to lost load, and they'd rather lose that value economically and for themselves, right? In pursuit of whatever political goals that they have, or whatever that they have to cater to, and just carry out outages in many cities. So basically, the main issue is, of course, of frequent sort of outages. They may not be long lasting, but that's again been a facet of electricity supply in India for many decades now. Which is you'll have an outage for 15 minutes, which means in those 15 minutes you've either got to make do with alternatives or just be in the dark, or in some cases in urban households you have inverters, right, which kind of cater to that 15 half an hour window. But then as you move out to notified town areas and panchayats and rural areas, you will find that the outages range in in 30 minutes to an hour, and multiple such outages, which could take the outages from supply to anywhere up to 3 hours, 3.5 hours, right? It has drastically come down. It has drastically come down because it has been mandated that supply needs to be kept, and increasingly consumers are finding value. But what we are seeing is that the amount of money that utilities are losing over time is not necessarily going down fast enough. I mean, it's not increasing at the pace at which it was increasing through the 2010s, but it's not going down fast enough. Tariffs still are not cost reflective. One can argue whether the cost of supply is high, but it's mainly outages. But the other underlying one, which we've highlighted in some of our studies, which also came to light, I remember when I was discussing this with some people who are citizen scientists, was the really poor quality of voltage supply in many parts of rural and second tier towns. And what we don't realize is this has implications for our ability to use critical appliances. It has implications for losses that the utility incurs in the supply of electricity because of just the way you're supplying. And it has implications for life of appliances, the cost that you incur. And all of these unfortunately are not factored in, and that's where I think the system needs to sort of really think about what will continuous reliable supply to every citizen in India, what will that mean in terms of economic value? I mean, an assessment can be done, but I think you just need to take it as gospel truth that it is indeed something that will be in some sense nirvana in some way, yeah, for the economy.
So, in fact, you just covered quite a few points that I'm sure that I think will come up later. So, for example, the issue of irregular billing and the fact that much of the electricity, much of the problems have to do with the way tariffs are structured, and particularly in connection with the agricultural sector. And then also the low voltage issue. So if I start with the context that DISCOM's responsibilities are to ensure quality of supply, metering, and billing, with that context in mind, can we first talk about the problems facing these distribution companies themselves, particularly from the financial side? And then we can maybe break down some of how that affects all the other things, the irregular billing, agricultural, the nexus with the agricultural sector, and low voltage issues.
Sure. So, again, the problem of, the malaise in the utilities when it comes to their finances is well documented, has been researched. And I think, even people who are not in the sector seem to be aware of what is running through. And to give a context, the Indian utilities have been losing money to the tune of about, $10 billion a year on average for the last, at least 4 or 5 years, right? Which means that you are not able to recover that money from your consumer. If you're not able to recover money, what do you do to operate next year? You take a loan, right? You take a loan to basically make good, whatever working capital requirements you need. And that loan needs to be paid back because, effectively, that's the only way somebody is going to give you money. In some cases, you do have bailouts, which we've seen in the past. We had the most recent round of bailouts, under the Uday scheme starting 2016, which ran for about 4 to 5 years, and then now we have the RDSS scheme, right, the revamped distribution sector scheme, which again comes with a whole host of conditions on how such bailouts will be affected. It's less of a bailout now; it's more of an incentive for distribution companies to take up some far-reaching reform, right? So the money, as I said, that they lose is primarily on account of. There is, of course, that non-cost reflective tariff, which is constantly brought up, which is that you're having to procure electricity at exorbitant rates, and you're not able to sort of apply tariffs to consumers across the board on average. That helps you recover. Now, in theory, the tariffs are set in a way that the DISCOM breaks even because they're not meant to make profits. But in practice, what ends up happening is that your calculations go for a toss because there's a large base of consumers who actually you don't recover anything from, and that number could be anywhere from 30% to 15, 30-35%. In fact, in some parts of the country, those losses could be anywhere north of even 40%, right? In some of the smaller jurisdictions, for instance, in Jammu and Kashmir, right? or in one of the northeastern states, the losses are staggering. But that said, in large states, for instance, like Tamil Nadu or in Rajasthan or in Uttar Pradesh, you could have numbers which are north of 20%, which are also not very suggest that the rot runs deep. And this is primarily because the government of the day makes promises to people saying, I will supply electricity at a certain price. The expectation is, and I think the legislation, the act also now mandates that any such subsidies that are given, I mean, notifications under the act, subsidies that are being given must be paid in full to the discom upfront. But the problem is that the distribution company is an extended arm of the government, so they use it as a bank. They don't necessarily pay up that subsidy money to the utility. Of course, it has improved over time, but it's still not gotten to a point where the utility is fully able to rely on the state government of the day to make good its promises. And in addition, you've got poor accountability on the discom, in the sense, there is lack of transparency in the way these discoms report their financials. There is a famous, among at least the policy groups, we talk about how there are different balance sheets that they have for different stakeholders. One for the regulator, one for the financier, one for the state government, and one possibly even for the central government. So one never really knows what the state of finances is. And for this reason, it becomes very difficult for us to really apportion blame, so to say, to any particular sector. So a lot of people go after agriculture and say that the supply to agriculture is coming at a very high cost because you're not able to recover money, because in many cases it is free of cost supply, or it's greatly subsidized. And what happens is the distribution company, to mask its own operational inefficiencies, ends up booking a lot of supply against agriculture and says, I've supplied so many million units of electricity to them, and all of this is basically has to be made good to me. But the state government obviously is not prepared to make good all of that. But the double whammy is that you're not actually able to measure what is the amount of electricity that's been supplied to those entities, because you don't have meters in agriculture in many jurisdictions. Because agricultural consumers, after this practice started possibly in the state of Andhra Pradesh, at the time of one of the leaders, and subsequently, it's kind of spread through like a wildfire to many states where barely any agricultural consumption gets metered, barring in pockets where there have been experiments or there are really good incentives in place. It really doesn't happen. So you blame agriculture at times. Sometimes you blame theft of electricity in rural areas and in peri-urban areas by consumers, specifically for instance in states like Uttar Pradesh. So because of all of this, it's become a bit of a challenge to as I said, talk about who specifically to blame. But by and large, the blame is on poorer consumers and who don't end up paying, or on agriculture across the states. And that's really where I want to leave it at. But so maybe you want to sort of stop here and take stock of what you've heard and what we want you to kind of get into more details on.
In fact, I think this is just the right point to mention, and I'm reading this out here. So in 2019 to 2020, 21% of the total electricity supply was sold to agricultural consumers, and their share in the total revenue collected was only 2%. And this is basically as I think your work also mentions, there is a cross subsidization happening. So the industrial consumers basically are subsidizing the agriculture consumers in a way. The industrial consumers contributed about 34% of the total revenue, whereas their share in the electricity sale was 28%. So and this seems to there doesn't seem to be an easy way out of this.
Yeah, I mean, which is exactly as I said, which is one of the reasons why utilities in urban areas like like urban areas of of Delhi and Mumbai, right, don't really have a challenge. But you've got utilities everywhere else where there's active farming and agriculture. You have a big problem. For instance, even in the state of Gujarat, which is one of the better performing discoms. In fact, I would say there's a vast divide between Gujarat and many other states of the country. Is primarily because they have such a large industrial consumer base, and they have a very small residential consumer base, and they don't actually have such a large exposure to agriculture, and they've managed to kind of also keep their agricultural consumption reasonably in check in terms of how much goes out. There is extensive metering, at least at the high level, to ensure that that there isn't this overbooking of supply to agriculture itself. So clearly the problem lies in it. And I think and I remember one of the statistics that I was looking at when we were part of an effort was, you won't believe it, 20% of all electricity that is supplied globally to agriculture globally is in India. It's a staggering statistic, right? It's a staggering statistic which tells you that it's either super inefficient or it's just incredulous, meaning that this number has been fudged, right? It is more likely the latter, primarily because the accounting is so poor and you're basically using assumptions at the best. For instance, you assume that there have been so many hours of supply, and so many consumers with so many kilowatts worth of pumps connected. So as a result, the consumption would have been so many units. You've actually not metered it. So given the number of assumptions and the layers of opaqueness that are there, it's very difficult to say whether that number is indeed true. And I think there are, of course, we can, of course, also talk about what is being done. And I think one of the key things that is being done right now, Sayoudh, to address this is trying to figure out how do we de-link supply of electricity to agricultural consumers from the grid itself. Meaning, the state of Maharashtra, for instance, under the Chief Minister's scheme, has come up with a very innovative proposal to supply electricity from solar feeders to agricultural consumers, which means that they will get power from what are normally called, feeders that are supplied by solar electricity, which means that it's active during the day, which is when the farmer also possibly wants to carry out his activities, right? There have been many schemes in the past where they've said, nighttime, our demand is low, so we'll supply during the night. So farmers had to, wake up in the middle of the night, and switch on their pumps. And, there were incidents of, farmers getting bitten by snakes in their field because they were going out in the dark. So all kinds of unintended consequences were there. But nevertheless, a lot of states persisted because, it was really the one way out wherein, you could give some sort of certainty to supply, because during the day, the rest of the economy is asking for power. Industries, commercial establishments, hospitals, houses, right? And farmers were the ones who were basically made to sort of, run around for their power, raat mein le lo thoda sa, get some in the evening. But now with the prospect of solar energy and solar feeders, there is the possibility that farmers can get, reasonably reliable electricity during those 8 hours when the sun is shining. And this also then means that once you put in that upfront cost of setting up that system, well, recovery is less of a challenge. Of course, you would still want to recover because that upfront money also has a cost to it, right? It's not free. But at least, you're not hemorrhaging money on a yearly basis, because, each unit of electricity that you procure otherwise from a power plant comes at at an exorbitant rate of, 5 rupees or 6 rupees, right? All included. And that means that the utility is constantly running after, banks to support, these losses. But now, because renewable energy is, as our power minister constantly says, is deflationary, in the sense that its price effectively is going down, because you've paid for it already, right? And on a yearly basis, the value of electricity is just lesser, the cost is lesser and lesser. So it's attractive, but again, it's also not easy, because there's a huge amount of capital that's required to, for instance, segregate feeders that will supply only to agricultural consumers. Feeder segregation is something that has been underway in many states, but it's not universal in any case. So it's a good solution for places where the segregation has happened. There are, for instance, schemes that look at farmers installing solar panels on their fields, supplying the surplus back to the grid, right, over and above whatever they consume, and then they get remunerated for it. Right. Then there are schemes which have basically looked at standalone electrification of pumps. Again, not the most successful of ones, but even that is available. You have a solar panel that basically caters to the needs of one particular pump instead of something that's connected to a grid, and that again absolves the grid of supplying to that particular pump. Farmers are not easily taking to this, because again, the expectation is that I want electricity whenever I need it. It's not that they're getting it today, but the fact that there is a government that's responsible for supplying it, and it's not, being outsourced to a solar panel that may or may not function 5 years after installation, is giving them jitters. So, and that's one of the reasons why obviously the uptake is not that rapid. But I think it's just a matter of time before they see that the reliability is more, that they are able to sort of address their own challenges better, right? And that the value that they're getting, the discom as well as the farmer, and I'm hoping there is a mechanism for sharing this value in some way, right? Which is obviously there. The government is putting up the upfront capital, will eventually mean that a lot more farmers start relying on this decentralized supply, and we will eventually be able to break this vicious cycle of loss making when it comes to supplying to agriculture, which is unaccounted, which then results in poorer service elsewhere, which means less consumers are paying for it. As I said, it's a kind of like a downward spiral, and hopefully it will manage to break it in the coming decade is the expectation. Yeah.
So, since we are on the subject of solar, if I could just take a quick aside and sort of talk about where things stand with respect to solar, the solar industry and energy storage, because that's clearly where the future is headed. Uh, we have a problem in India right now in the sense that the manufacturing of solar PVs is extremely capital intensive, requires a modicum of skilled labor and large capital investment. And these are clearly impediments. One could argue that there are similar impediments to energy storage, battery manufacturing also. Lack of unavailability of raw materials, again, large capital investment and such. Where do you see the future of solar and battery manufacturing in light of these problems?
Right. I think as you know, there have been 2 rounds of PLI scheme for solar PV that have already been, conducted and successfully so. And the expectation is the PLI, for those listeners who are not aware of it, is the production linked incentive scheme, which the government rolled out for multiple sectors of the economy, right, at a cost of about 1,45,000 crore over many years, of course. And specifically, the solar PV one, I think, was fairly oversubscribed, right, both the rounds. And we have, potentially anywhere north of 35 gigawatt worth of capacity, where from end to end, right from the silicon ingots to the module, potentially being manufactured in India in the next 5 to 6 years, right? We could potentially have north of 35 gigawatts of manufacturing capacity, which is basically end to end. That's phenomenal. We're looking at investments that would possibly be of the order of tens of billions that will have to come from the private sector, being incentivized through this money that the government of India is providing, basically, which is for every watt of cell manufactured, you basically get a certain share of the cost of that, right? Maybe a 10 to 15% incentive from the government, and of course, then they get the market price as well. And this has incentivized a lot of companies to come forward and put this up. So it is well underway. It's well underway. The challenge, though, is this, which is that while manufacturing plans are afoot, there is this tentativeness with regard to how much is India able to absorb of new renewable energy in the economy. So, for instance, India had a target, and this was not part of our formal commitment under the UNFCCC, whether it's the NDCs or anything else, of 500 gigawatt of non-fossil capacity. It was 50% of, the commitment is 50% of our installed capacity base in 2030 would be non-fossil. Internally, the understanding was that 500 gigawatt would at least be there. But then slowly, we are sort of beginning to doubt whether we have the wherewithal to be able to install at a pace which will get us to 500 gigawatts by 2030, which is why it's not part of any formal commitments. And that is a slight problem because, unless the industry has a certainty that, the government is going to drive installation at that kind of pace, will the committed investments actually happen is a question. There is an expectation, of course, from the global audience that because of the China plus one strategy, right, where everybody wants to have a plan B in the event China goes rogue and things, deteriorate when it comes to, geopolitical tensions between the powers that be, they should have an alternative source of supply for some of these. And India is one such market which is already being tapped by, for instance, US developers, Japan, European developers. So everybody certainly wants a way out. So there is a business case for a certain amount of capacity to supply to these markets at a premium. But obviously, it may not be nearly as big as what the domestic market might have to offer because of the sheer scale of India's ambition. So unless there is clarity in India's ambitions, and what the domestic industry is willing to do, you may not find that manufacturing may take hold in the way that the PLI scheme is intended to, or at the pace at which we need to get our 500 gigawatt target. Now that said, the reason why the domestic industry is not able to give that confidence, which is the developers, is because they're all looking for people to say, you know what, I will buy the power from you. You put in a solar power plant, right? And somebody has to say, I will buy the power from you. Now the challenge is power from a solar plant is intermittent, because intermittent in the sense that it's available, of course, only 8 to 9 hours a day. But even in those 8 to 9 hours, you may have a cloudy day, you may have a rainy day, right? So it doesn't guarantee you supply every day of the year for those 8 hours. But more importantly, outside of those 8 hours, what are you going to do, right? Because power demand is there very much outside of those hours. So as you go to a system that's increasingly intermittent, you want some assurances that the supply will continue to come even when the sun is not shining, and that inherently then relies on an oversized solar system that will generate more than what is required during the day, will store that electricity in a battery, and that battery will basically supply to the grid as and when it wants it, evening, night, late, early morning, whatever it might be. Now, this is where the catch is, that because we are all used to the system which is, at our control, which is a coal-based power plant or a gas-based power plant or a hydro power plant or a nuclear power plant to a lesser extent, but nevertheless, it is still very much under our control. The system operators and the utilities and everybody today is like, yeah, but when your source of energy is not in your control, what do you do? How do you commit to delivering at any time? And the cost of that technology is high. So when you look at electricity that is generated from solar and then pushed through a battery and then you supply it, right? That can be pricey, which is why you have what is called these round the clock bids today, which can potentially provide electricity at rates that are now competitive with coal. For instance, a newly built coal-fired power plant, let's say the ones that are being planned today, not under construction, could be providing electricity at a cost of anywhere between 4.6 to 5 rupees a kilowatt hour. And the most recent tender for battery plus storage system, battery plus solar system was actually at 4.5 plus, slightly over, which means that it can actually compete. But the thing is, everybody's like, yeah, but who's going to provide, who's going to offtake that, who's going to buy it? And that is that's kind of like a chicken and the egg, right? This is a growing economy where there's going to be huge amounts of demand for power. But the problem is the distribution companies are not able to figure out who's going to pay for that power, right? Where is that pathway for me to, where's that economic growth prospect that will allow for all these millions of households who've come into the power grid in recent years to earn a living and to be able to generate revenues, money that will allow for payment of additional electricity. So it's like, it feels like the utilities don't understand the India growth story, that electricity is fundamental to the India growth story. And if you as a utility are like, I don't know who's going to buy power and who's going to pay for it, you're fundamentally not believing in the India growth story. And this dissonance is because of the experience that they've had over the many decades where, yes, there have been lofty claims around demand, materializing, etc. But none of that has actually resulted in their financial position changing. So if you have to continue supplying higher amounts of electricity while you continue to hemorrhage money, on a per unit basis, even if that were to remain constant, that's not a good proposition. Because even though they're not profit-making entities, they still need to raise capital out there. And there's a lot of pressure on the people who operate them to, at least not lose money in the way they are today. So unless we're able to kind of break that that sort of vicious cycle that we've described earlier, you will always find this position where everybody wants to install capacity, but nobody wants to buy the electricity because there is no belief that you can actually make money or return, recoup the money that you spend in buying the electricity. And this can only change when, there is a full value of electricity that is embedded in every consumer's decision, right? Whether it's a poor household that is looking to, have electricity for having its children study, under light, so that they can go to school, etc., or a farmer who's looking to find value for his produce, right? Or, a rural enterprise is looking to, do some value add on agricultural produce or whatever local, skill that exists to be able to sell that elsewhere. If none of these people are able to figure out that electricity is critical to my future prospects, and they all keep thinking that electricity needs to be free because I can't guarantee that there will be livelihood opportunities beyond immediate consumption of electricity, then we are going to be stuck here. So this does rely on this systemic change in expectation of what electricity does for you, right? And that needs to come with, I think, a lot of conditioning. There needs to be exposure to the kind of opportunities, especially in the cases, for instance, like rural livelihoods and farmers willing to pay for it, right, and all of that. It's going to take some time, right? I think we've tried to kind of push it from the supply side, but I think now the demand side needs to gear up so that it says, okay, I will pay for the supply you're giving me, which will then give confidence to utilities to go ahead and procure power, right? Or at least whether it's from the market or from long-term agreements is a different thing, and that will then kickstart this industry. So long to answer your question, in a few words, absolutely, there is indeed a future for manufacturing of solar PV and batteries in the country. The materials are not so much a constraint today. But that said, India is going to be a very, very small player in the battery manufacturing space by the end of this decade. Our annual requirement is already such a small fraction of what the global capacity is that what we will end up having by 2030 is a minuscule portion of the global supply chains. So I think there is, it's not like we're competing at the scale at which, we have to really worry about whether we will get access to any of the minerals. It can become a problem if we were to really scale up our ambitions. But that said, that's a problem not just for India, it's a problem for the world. Because at the global level, you don't want a concentration of everything, which has unfortunately been the case because, of the elephant in the room is China, right? They've taken a head start in pretty much every sector. Even in a sector like automobile, where India was probably leaps and bounds ahead when it comes to the conventional vehicles, China is now one of the leading manufacturers of electric vehicles, right? This is the new tech, and they have sort of surged ahead. So because of this, there's a feeling that ultimately there will be a squeezing of supply on a lot of these things because it's all going to one market. If I had a substantial plan, because ultimately that's the thing that we need to remember, which is I was looking at these numbers today. The coal, just digging coal out of the ground, is getting India close to about 2 lakh crore a year in revenues to the railways and putting out that much money into the economy. Solar PV today is probably around 7,500 crore. Okay. Batteries, you can imagine, obviously much lesser. So they have a long way to catch up, which means that the value addition that, these new technologies need to provide for those to become mainstream and for actors to think that, hey, this is a source of economic growth for me, they have to substantially grow. Until then, everybody is going to be thinking of those as being in the margin, and that, what I need to predominantly promote and what I need to continuously ensure that I don't drop the ball is this big system that I have. So as a result, there is this continued plans for more coal-based power, right? All of that is happening because there is a huge economic benefit from there. Because literally it's money that's under your feet, right? Which is not the case with solar PV or with batteries, because we are today procuring a bunch of things from outside, adding a little bit of value and selling it. Even in the case where it fully were to become domestic, the value chain through the PLI scheme, for instance, we anticipate that the value add may be to the tune of about 75,000 crore in another 5 years. Coal is already at 2 lakh crore, right? So you can imagine that, there are these challenges the government of India is going through and the actors are going through. And this is a challenge for any economy that has fossil fuels embedded at some level into its, overall energy mix, whether it's energy security, whether it's, revenue security for governments, provincial or the center. These things need to be sort of factored in when you make this decision to transition. But the reality is, Sayoudh, that whether it's not for climate change, we should not be looking at this as acting for climate change. We should be looking at this as what is the best way in which we can give the lowest cost electricity to our consumers. Because as I said, for a growing economy, electricity is the food that will enable it to grow, is the primary input. Because that's what the economy is today. The economy is running, while electricity in the total final energy consumption, as it's called, right, is only about 18% in India, which means, of course, oil and coal and, and end users is big. But we're increasingly looking at a world where more and more things are electric. Whether it's your cars, whether it's industries, whether it is, what you consume at home, right? if that is going to be the future, you've got to provide it more and more of it. And the good part is converting a lot of things to electricity means you're addressing the challenges of emissions that happen close to where people are living, right? Because ultimately, air pollution, which is, as you know, one of the biggest challenges that face India today, here and now, is primarily caused by the use of fossil fuels. So, if not for climate change, we should be thinking about a highly electrified economy where the emissions close to where people are living and in their households, where they're commuting, in the offices and in the public spaces they are in, should be as little as possible. And that alone has such a phenomenal what do you call it, positive benefit of avoided mortality, avoided disease burden, that it rivals, for instance, many other child development programs that we might have. That is the burden of air pollution today. So I'd say there is a big reason for us to act, to be able to bring in these new technologies that wean us away from coal. While we know that coal definitely is important today because that is what we have, we've got to actively figure out how do we decrease the cost of electricity that we provide our consumers with. Because let's be very clear, India has one of the most expensive electricity prices in the world on a purchasing power parity basis, right? Right? Which means that, of course, for households, etc., it's subsidized and whatnot. But the problem is it's costing the economy. Right? And ultimately, if you don't grow the pie, you can't keep dividing the pie, through populist measures because your pie is not growing. And then, you have a case of, we're just wearing down the economy. We'll be consuming a lot of stuff, but we're not producing enough. So you've got to grow the economic pie. And for this, electricity for productive activity has to be cheaper. And cheaper electricity today, as we see it, is most certainly not from coal necessarily. There are many other considerations for coal to be providing it, but coal is not necessarily the most cost effective, but it is an option that's available to India. The financing for it is available in India. The technical ability to extract energy from there is available in India. And for all of these reasons, we seek comfort in it. But if you were to look at the environmental fallouts, forget climate change, we should really be looking at moving away from it. And that, I think, will have positive implications for distribution companies. Right? It'll have positive implications for consumers who will have potentially not growing electricity prices, but at least stable electricity prices, so that they're able to then better pay for the services that they consume, which will then mean that the utilities are able to invest in augmenting the distribution system, which is decrepit in many parts of the country. Right? In many urban areas, for instance, it's aging infrastructure, right? It's probably 30 years old, 40 years old. Frequent outages. If you live in a dense pocket in Delhi, you might find, on a hot summer day or a night, you might find outages because the transformer is not able to handle it. It needs more investment, right? So all of this will happen. So there is definitely like a positive cycle that we develop the moment the cost of electricity to the utilities goes down. And today, unfortunately, our conventional sources is not delivering that. RE plus storage can, but it needs to be facilitated through a lot of investment that's upfront. And for that, I think we need to think slightly beyond tomorrow. We need to think 10 years from now. We need to ensure that that industry and the value add that we expect from it will be captured through domestic entities. Otherwise, I think we will certainly be stuck in this by thinking, hey, this is not an industry that India is supporting. We should take this transition slower.
So, sticking with the theme of the future and also connecting to the issue that you highlighted just a while earlier about suppliers not having confidence that there will be enough demand. We could at this point talk about what the future of household demand in the electricity sector looks like. And to tie this in, we could discuss about the smart meter survey that was done, because it talks a lot about where household demand comes from, where most of the demand comes from, how households can be segregated on the basis of low demand versus high demand, and what it tells us about the future. So, as was pointed out in the report, one of the key sources of demand of electricity is the use of appliances.
So, as I said, today in the Indian economy, roughly about a quarter of the electricity is going to households, right? As we kind of become like an economy which is much like the US or the EU, it's the services sector, it's households. There is a lot more appliances, there's cooling requirement. All of this means that a larger share of our consumption is going to happen in households, and unfortunately today it is a part of the economy that's not really contributing to the recovery of the cost of the distribution company experiences. And as a result, we need mechanisms by which we first of all make this consumption within households the most efficient. And the way to do that is by basically getting consumers to get a sense of what are they spending money on, their electricity on, and is there a better way to get value for the money that they will spend in the future. And for this, you need information that will actually drive their decision making. And this information will come from smart meters. In a situation where like we are in today, where smart meters are kind of being looked at to decrease theft and loss of economic value for the utility. The future is really where consumers make a more informed choice around when to consume, how much to consume, and at what price to consume, right? And because effectively it's a communicating meter to the extent that you enable it, to the extent that it's integrated with the various appliances that you use. Sounds very futuristic, right? Running your washing machine at a time when the prices are low, or switching off your refrigerator at a time when the prices are super high. But then things are not going to go bad in your refrigerator because it has that inherent heat, or the cooling that's been preserved within it. Or switching on your air conditioner at a time of day when it's actually sort of cool, I mean the prices are low, and sort of shutting it off for that brief period when it's possibly again spiking, because it's 15-minute 1 hour spikes that potentially can make the difference for the sector as a whole, right? And when millions of households potentially give up their consumption because the prices are touching a certain level, you can actually free up resources for the rest of the economy. So there is a role for smart meters to play beyond just helping the utility identify who's consumed at what time, and when to whether they are evading paying for it, etc. It's really about also the future of the system, where you can synchronize, right, what consumers want and with what you're able to provide. And if there is a gap, get consumers to say, what, I'm willing to not consume at this particular hour, right, or willing to consume at this particular hour because the prices are lower. And as a result, you bring down your overall the size of the system. You're kind of doing this in a way that is not burdening the system. That's this is called demand side management, or as it's called, right, demand response, as it's called, right, more recently. And this is something that will require 250 million households in India to be connected to this the web, so to say, where they're constantly transmitting information. But more importantly, you will require a system that's able to assimilate all this information, provide insights to consumers, provide insights to distribution utilities. And it's a very different system from what we have today, where you don't have this kind of interaction between the utility and the consumer. You don't have a utility that's necessarily primed to sort of look at that kind of data. So all of this, as I said, is futuristic, but at the same time, we need to take baby steps towards ensuring that the capabilities at every level are built in for us to leverage what technology can provide us. Right? We can certainly do it the old school way, right? Where there are, it's in a very planned system, right? Where you go in and report, every day what appliances you are kind of consuming. There used to be, back in the day, there used to be, to help plan for a local area, you had to actually go and report to your local authority that, I've bought a refrigerator in my house. I've got an additional XYZ appliance, possibly through the 70s and 80s, but not a feasible situation today, right? Because of the rate at which appliance penetration is happening. So you need to do this in a smart way. And this is one of them. And this will also ensure then that there is a clear direction to the utility saying, what, this is how my consumption is going to go and increase in a particular area. I need to either use these demand side measures to incentivize them to consume less, or improve the efficiency of appliances in a particular area because, currently they are not as efficient as they are in any other, or augment the supply that actually goes into these, which means, you'll have to actually literally provide more wires that go in from, the local substation into this particular distribution transformers, which will require, civil labor and whatnot. It's cost effective. It costs a lot of money, which will have to be then a burden on the system. So you make all of these different trade-offs. Today, all of these decisions are made without the full knowledge of what that future will look like. Smart meters can certainly enable us a glimpse into what that future will look like, because you're already getting real-time information of how people are sort of moving along that path that you anticipate them to as economic growth happens in the various households. And that's really what we think the future of smart meters is, right? Today, unfortunately, as I said, it's being used to primarily see, who is basically escaping this payment net, right? Is there 30-minute consumption data? When I add it up, is it coming up to a number that I anticipate it to be, right? Because it's being transmitted. There is no question of tampering, at the month end and whatnot. It's being sent in regularly, and suddenly one day you find that the data is not coming through. What have they consumed on a daily basis, so that you can penalize them. But that's a very small use case, right? And that's the use case which is being used to currently at least promote them today, because recovery of money is also an important part. But the value that they bring is manyfold the value of just billing the consumers. And in any case, it's an overkill just to bill consumers to have smart meters. I think there are low tech solutions just to I think there's no shortage of manpower today, and there's no shortage of technology to enable data collection to happen. Especially monthly metering ke liye to you don't need that, right? You can have these technologies where there is a data transmitter and the meter, and you can have a vehicle that goes through the street that can collect that data even as it's moving through, right? From a local RF mesh or whatever it might be. But why go for a smart meter in every household which is communicating, every 15 minutes with some utility to to provide that data, which then becomes a data management challenge. So to solve the billing issue, you don't need smart meters. But what to really make the system ready for the future, smart meters certainly will play a big important role.
I see. I think the report also discusses very briefly about some of the ways in which smart meters are being deployed. So there's like a savings linked leasing model, and there's a savings linked model. Um, could you tell us about a little bit about the deployment strategies that the government is considering?
I mean, of course, so you're talking about savings links model for appliances, or you're talking about smart meters?
Smart meters, sorry.
See, yeah. So, ultimately, whatever model it is, the challenge is that today the distribution company needs to pay more per consumer or spend more money per consumer to have a smart meter, because it is additional investment. Now, would the utility want to go ahead and spend, 3,500 rupees per household to enable this? Probably not. So they will now have to go and look at a model where they are basically, amortizing that cost onto a monthly plan, which says that, what, I'm going to pay you 60 rupees or 70 rupees a month per consumer for the next 7 or 8 years, or whatever it might be, right? The period, or perhaps it's a perpetual payment, to enable you to basically provide the data and the insights, etc. And this is a lease. You're effectively basically taking the product, you're paying for the service that it's providing on a monthly basis. Now, alternatively, you could say, you know what, I'm going to pay you for effectively helping me bring down, right, my losses and the amount of money that you're basically saving me on account of the deployment of these smart meters. So you have a baseline, and you say that the deployment must result in, revenue cost savings or revenue augmentation of so much, and then you basically get a certain cut of it. So irrespective, the ultimate thing, as I said today, is the utility is seeing it as a way of increasing its revenue net. And the problem is it can't pay upfront for any of these things because it just doesn't have the capacity to. Because you can't suddenly front load your consumers with that kind of money, right? Even if you're financing it, you can't front load it onto your consumers. So it has to be brought on slowly. And the distribution company and the regulator could always argue, why do you want to spend more money to recover, right? I'm already giving you, already the resources that you need. You're telling me you want to spend another 80 rupees per person to be able to recover his dues. I'm sorry, I don't think I can grant you that. So there is a bit of a tiff between the regulator and the utility as well, saying, what is the guarantee that, that after spending this, you will get it back? And why should I basically, allow this? Because I'm giving you all the allowances to, for collection efficiency, etc. is already provided. So if you can't perform at this level, then what are you doing? So to address these challenges, you've come up with these business models, but increasingly, as I said, this RDSS scheme, which basically is a 3 lakh crore scheme between center and state government, nearly a third of it coming from central government contributions, incentivizes more and more deployment of smart meters. So it's almost as if it's a fait accompli. It doesn't matter what the business model is. You're basically saying that this is the future. There are too many loopholes in the way the current metering happens. And the government of India, after, in all its wisdom, after having seen, every trick in the book that the Indian consumer throws at them, has come up with a solution that, this is the only way I can prevent you from going out of my revenue net. Right? I monitor you closely. You will pay for it. And that's the way I'm going to solve for this. So it's a very hard technology driven solution for this problem. We certainly think there's merit to it, because we have also seen it play all of these when we go to the field to visit and see the innovative ways in which people kind of hook onto the electricity cables without having to pay for it, bypassing the meters, tampering with the meters, acting in collusion with the meter readers, to basically not pay the bill. So there's enough avenues in between the consumer and the utility for the ball to be dropped, as in the money to basically disappear. And the government feels that this is a good way to sort of stop that. Certainly is one, but it also tells you of that, as I said, these are all forced solutions. These are not solutions that the people are willing to accept. They spread canard about this, in local newspapers, local WhatsApp groups, for instance, among community members will tell you, don't allow smart meters in your household. It increases the bill for you because they control it from the outside. An incident that happened in the state of, I think in Mathura, for instance, where close to 1 lakh consumers were left without electricity, on a key evening. I forget what date it was, whether it was Holi or whether it was one such celebration, where I think accidentally, or perhaps there was some hidden agenda of somebody to make it look like smart meters are detrimental. They cut off supply to 1 lakh consumers, and that resulted in a significant backlash where consumers was like, what, we've paid our bills. Why are you cutting off our supply? So all of these, different actors are there, who've got vested interests in the current system, right? Somebody who's currently making money under the table, so to say, right? Because of the current system, possibly seeing his revenues being watered away. So he or she wants to, do what they did. So there are a range of actors who want the existing, inefficiencies because somebody is making money clearly, right? And that's what we need to overcome. And I think for deployment of smart meters, one of the things is there has to be an active campaign that the utility needs to run, where they educate the consumers of the benefits. They tell them of, in how many different ways can the utility improve its supply to them, and ensure that there is some sort of like a new social norm that sort of, prevails over and above any other factors that might, be brought into the narrative. That you've got to pay. If you don't pay, you become sort of like somebody who's a bit of a pariah, right? You're not paying for your electricity. Right? Today, do we even see somebody who doesn't pay for the electricity or separate their waste at home? Are they seen as outcasts? They're not, because that's the norm. So how do you create a new social norm that actually gets people to be timely when it comes to the payment of electricity services, right? Much like, be good civic-minded folk, really, right? And we're hoping that, unless not hoping, I think we've also developed a standard operating protocol to ensure that the utility communicates with the consumers in a way that gets them to sort of fall in line. And not sort of, be detractors, and spread the wrong message among the public that then causes, bigger challenges when it comes to the broader rollout of it.
I see. Several interesting points to discuss here. But I'd just like to close our discussion of smart meters with one fact that I found really interesting in the report, which discusses the pattern of power usage that the smart meters found. And so there's the clear demarcation between like households that are low power users below 200 kilowatt hours and households that are above that figure. And the low power users see a very constant band of power usage as opposed to the high power users. And I thought that was really informative for like anybody trying to decide to supply power to the sector. So I was wondering if like you could just talk about the implications of those.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's a bit of a no-brainer, right? That electricity, that households that basically have heavy-duty appliances, primarily, in the Indian context where we are in a tropical environment, it's cooling more so than heating that really prevails so much of the year. households that have an air conditioner are going to be head and shoulders above the demand that non-air conditioned household is going to see. And that is what we also saw. Um, and you talked about the numbers, right, where the consumption could be anywhere north of 200, significantly higher than that, ranging from 200 to 1,000, whereas the others were predominantly within 200 units a month. And that is primarily driven by the increasing aspirations, right? Everybody wants to sort of obviously live in a comfortable setting, which means that you want to use an air conditioner for as many hours as your wallet will afford you to. So we found that, for instance, an average household is using it for 5.5 hours, right? For instance, in a city like Delhi, you and I during the summer probably switch on our air conditioners at, but I don't know, 9:30, 10 maybe, right, in the bedroom, if it's a split air conditioner or a window AC, not a centralized system, and we might run it through till, I don't know, 4:35 in the morning, right? Maybe some people put in a 8-hour timer there, right? That maybe cut it slightly before, but otherwise, in a typical household, it's when you're asleep, right? You want to sleep in reasonable comfort, when the mosquito is not biting you or whatever. Whereas that number is 5.5 hours. So you can clearly see that there is that notion that I can't use it for the entire night, right? And possibly the 5.5 hours is also split between a little bit of daytime usage and a nighttime usage, right? In the daytime, whoever is there, possibly at a 3 p.m. when the temperature is the highest, they may want to get a little bit of reprieve, so they may use it then, and then a little bit of usage in the night, so that at least when you're going to sleep, you're sleeping in comfort. But then once you're in deep sleep, possibly it doesn't affect you as much, so you are willing to take a bit of an increase in temperature. So it's still a commodity that is being used in a rationed manner. I mean, an air conditioner, and I'm saying, the use of the air conditioner. So there is a long way to go, right? Because everybody has the right to, experience comfort, within the confines in their home. And of course, notwithstanding their ability to, pay for it. And we know that more and more people will find the ways to pay for it. Or for that matter, it may come to a point where people will say, what, this is as important as water is to my existence, because temperatures are going to become that high. You're going to become, I've heard of stories where people, for instance, in poorer sections of society, for instance, popping pills to be able to sleep in the night because it's just so oppressive, the weather, right? In certain humid conditions, whether it's in the outskirts of Mumbai or a Chennai or a Kolkata, and that's the reality. And it's a tragedy that those consumers have to kind of take those drastic choices to be able to get a good night's sleep. While there are, of course, solutions that rely on cool roofs and better design of buildings so that they're not retaining heat, those are more it's kind of upturning the system. It's not a simple fix like installing an air conditioner and going with it. As much as there is a benefit to kind of looking at a design based solution to it, which is long term, and not a knee jerk solution which is like here, take more energy and consume more energy and you'll cool yourself. But that is the immediate solution that bulk of the people living in households today are going to think about. Maybe somebody who's building a new house for himself or herself might say that I want to build it in such a way that I'm exposing myself less to the vagaries of climate and and electricity availability, and making it cool by design. But a bulk of people are going to look at solutions for the households they live in today. And most of them are not energy efficient when it comes to the building envelope, right? And we saw that as well. That was another assessment that we actually did in terms of households that were designed to basically face the right directions, right, in terms of the heat load that they were facing. What was it? What did their electricity usage tell about the implication of their household's layout vis-a-vis their consumption? And we clearly find signs that households that are not designed well and that do not have the right alignment when it comes to the way it sort of avoids the sun's rays do end up seeing a higher thermal load. So it is intricately linked to a range of things, but ultimately it's about whether you're able to stomach the impact in your pocket. If you're able to, you will use it. If you're not, you won't. And in a world where the temperature rise is likely to be, as I said, on average 2 degrees, but in certain pockets and in certain days it may be as high as 6 or 7 degrees, as we've seen, through 2023 in different parts of the globe. I mean, that's really oppressive. As they say, right, if the wet bulb temperature were to go beyond 35 degrees centigrade, right, the combination of humidity and temperature, the human body's ability to sweat out and actually cool yourself is compromised. And in fact, it's impossible to. So when we're looking at serious mortality, there is no question but to allow for the air conditioning to happen, Shayud. So it will become a mandatory service. We may end up having, public spaces which offer cooling, for instance, to the people if we really care about our population. And in that scenario, we have to really think about how do we manage electricity demand. Yeah, and that future is perhaps not too far away, but let's hope that we leave ourselves some breathing room, financial as well as technical, to be able to address that future. I think we've certainly made strides, but there's a lot to be done because it's a highly iniquitous situation that we face today, where I think the rich have the resources to be able to kind of pull together any supply side solution that they need to be able to satisfy their requirement, whereas a lot of the poor do not have access to that. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ganesan. This was all quite helpful, and there were several aspects of this that I did not really encounter before, and so thank you for that. I would just like to say, if I'd just like to invite you to make any remarks on anything related to this that you would like to focus on or stress on, or that hasn't come up yet.
It's a looking 20 years into the future. I think what we really need to think about is it's not about. Let me rephrase that. Looking into the future, I think our objective must be how do we provide a higher standard of living to the population that we support in a way that is, least detrimental to the environment that we live in, and more importantly, is within the affordability of a large part of the population. And we must choose that option to be able to supply electricity to them. And that will require a range of things to happen, right from the generation of electricity to the way we supply it and to the way people consume it. And each one of these systems today, is riddled with its share of, legacy issues, whether it is, distorted energy prices for some consumers, to distorted incentives to public sector undertakings to continue doing certain things the way they do, to the legacy systems that we have in between, between the generator and the consumers of power, in the way they supply electricity and in the way they engage with the consumer. So it requires a wholesale transformation. So it's not that, tomorrow renewable energy is going to alleviate our problems. Or for that matter, coal is going to make our problems worse. There are lots of things in the value chain to make things better or worse. Some of these are, of course, low-hanging fruits, which we should tap into. And some of these are sort of, things that we really don't have too much control over. For instance, whether, we will end up being dependent on coal for the rest of the decade is almost a fait accompli. We will, because we don't have an alternative that's scaling up fast enough. So let's not, look at what the West is telling us today and saying, you need to stop coal right now. Oh, that's your responsibility, right? You've had your share of your contributions. We need to take care of me here and now. But then let's ensure we're not losing sight of where we want to be 20 years from now. And I think if policymakers are able to sort of look at that 20-year future and not just what's ahead of them today and tomorrow and make their decisions based on where we should be in that 20 years time frame, I think we will set right a lot of things. Not easily, far easier said than done, because we know that everybody operates with various different cycles. There's a bureaucrat cycle, there's a political cycle, right? There's an economic cycle on top of all of that. Notwithstanding all of these, I just hope we have the wherewithal to be able to look further in, because we have the view of what the future is going to look like. A climate change future, a future where there is much bigger health burden associated with our current population on account of the environmental pressures that we are subjected to. Keeping all those in mind, taking a decision that kind of keeps our population in the best possible shape in a 2050 or a 2070 will, I think, result in the best outcomes for us.
I see. Thank you again, Mr. Ganesan, for taking the time out.
Thank you, Sayoudh. Thank you for having me on this. I really appreciated the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Interpreting India. Stay tuned for our upcoming episodes. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your preferred podcast platform. To stay updated on our research and team, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. For in-depth insights, visit us at carnegieindia.org. See you next time.